Good morning, ladies. I hope you are all having a wonderful day and you had a good weekend. Sorry, I can't be in class with you today. Actually, I'm going to be out on Friday as well. So, my daughter isn't feeling well today, so she's staying home from school. And Friday, I am going to be doing a professional development. Well, it's not really a seminar because I can't go, but we're doing it virtually, a webinar all day. So, I won't be in class. But don't fear, we're still having a test on Friday. Today, we are going to be wrapping up our unit. We really don't have that much more to do. So it's just a little bit of notes to finish up in your note packet. I have one more journal for you. And you're going to hang on to those journals. You're going to turn those in on Friday along with your test. And then the rest of the class, there is a Kahoot that you can use to practice and start studying for the test. And you can have the rest of the time today to prepare for that. Okay, so we're going to start and finish up our notes first. So if you have your note packet handy, we're going to be talking about how you change the Constitution. Okay, so the Constitution, when you look at it, it is obviously the same, but yet it's a little bit different because of amendments. And so when we change the Constitution, it can be changed in two ways. The first way that we're going to talk about is the formal amendment. And so that's changes or additions that become part of the written language of the document itself. Okay. So that's called a formal amendment. So when we, like in history class, we learned some of the amendments. You just went over the Bill of Rights. Those are formal changes. So it has changed the written language, or it's become part of the written language of the Constitution. There's four ways to do that. We're really just going to look at the first method because that is the one that's been used the most. Not that the other three aren't important, but for our purposes, we're just going to look at that. It's really an example of how federalism works because since we have a federal system, which is when power is divided between a national government and state government, it takes both the federal government and state governments in order to change or to ratify a formal amendment. The other way is just kind of like general idea of by other informal means. And so we'll get to that here in a moment, but let's take a look at that first method. So when we look at changing the written language or adding to the Constitution by amendment, this first method, you propose an amendment in Congress. Okay, so most of our amendments have been done this way. It's proposed in each house. So it has to go through both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it has to have a 2/3 vote. Okay, so it's not like just a majority. It's not like how they pass a bill into law. It's very different. Then, instead of like how a bill becomes a law where it would go to the desk of the president to be signed into law, the president doesn't have anything to do with the amendment process. This is all Congress, and it's all about Congress and state legislature. So it's all about the legislative branch on both levels of government. So it's proposed by Congress with a 2/3 vote in each house, and then it's ratified by 3/4 state legislatures. So if you are looking at that in modern day, that's 38 out of 50 states. So that's quite a few states. Definitely not just like majority, but it has to have a huge support in a lot of states. So if you can kind of imagine that for a minute, it's been almost 30 years since we've had an amendment to the Constitution, and it's not difficult in terms of like the way that this works. However, it is difficult because it can be a really long process in order to have an amendment because it is such an important document. And since it is what guides us, in everyday government, it has to be a really, really important issue that has a lot of support. So we've only have 27 amendments, and 26 of them this is what the method that they've used. So other methods include like it can be proposed at the state level. They can have like conventions where delegates meet, kind of like how they did the Constitutional Convention. But in reality, this first method is the most efficient way because we already have elected officials to kind of do this stuff for us. So this is why we're just really paying attention to that. Let me go back for a second. Paying attention to that formal amendment. Okay, so when we look at the Constitution and the amendments, we took a lot of time last week and into the week before that looking at the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights is that first 10 amendments. Now you guys know, you guys are pretty good on the quiz. I'll be posting those grades if I haven't done that already this week. But the Bill of Rights, remember the first 9 is all about your individual rights, and then the 10th Amendment is state rights, okay? And it just guarantees those liberties of each person, fair and equal treatment before the law. And again, that was ratified, or that was added and ratified 3 years after the Constitution. One thing I wanted to say on the slide before about ratification. So an amendment isn't an amendment until it is ratified, okay? So for example, I said it's kind of a long process. It can take up to like a year, maybe even 2 years for an amendment to actually go through this whole process. So it can take a very long time. Okay, back to the slide. Later amendments. So basically in your book on page 76, there are all of the amendments that are listed, many of which you guys already know because you learn a lot of them throughout history classes. Maybe you're sitting there thinking like, well, I don't remember any of those, but you probably do. So again, we haven't had that many amendments when you really think about how long our country has existed, and we only have 27. And the first 10 were done 3 years after the Constitution was ratified. So it's usually a pretty important issue. And it's usually because there's a specific issue that's occurring during that time period. So like if you look at really the 12th, 13th, and 14th Amendments were all passed around relatively the same time, around the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, for example. So it all kind of revolves around that. The 19th Amendment, of course, yay for us, women's suffrage just celebrated the 100th anniversary last month, but actually 2 months ago in August. And women's suffrage would be an issue that would be a great example of something that took a really, really long time. So if you remember from history class, it's like 60 or 70 years to actually get an amendment to the Constitution. So from the time the movement started until the time we actually get an amendment was a very, very long time. Even things like the 22nd Amendment, which sets term limits for the president. We often think that has always been law, but actually it hasn't. And we'll talk about that in a second when we look at kind of customs of how that can change the Constitution. But the 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951, and that actually sets the 2-term limit for our president, which we did not actually have that in law before. Okay, so that was the formal amendment, changing it through that process of proposing 2/3 in each house and then a ratification by 3/4 of the states. So now we're going to look at constitutional change by other means. And in your book, it's in chapter 3, section 3. And it's kind of like, well, what the heck does that mean? It doesn't really say too much about it. But we're really looking at the ways in which we're not necessarily changing the wording. Okay, we're not doing a formal amendment, but through everyday experiences, whether it's the passage of basic legislation by Congress, actions taken by the president, key decisions of the Supreme Court, the activities of political parties, or custom or tradition, all of these things have played a part in some interpretation or maybe like fulfilling some of the aspects of the Constitution that's not actually written in there. So that kind of sounds a little confusing, but I'll give you some examples here in a moment. So we're really looking at the first 3, Congress, President, and Supreme Court. Those are basically the 3 branches of government. So legislative, executive, and judicial. So them exercising their powers that are given to them in the Constitution and extending upon some of those powers has helped kind of change or adapt the Constitution in modern ways. Definitely. Number 4 talks about the activities of political parties. So we'll look at that in a moment. But political parties aren't actually mentioned in the Constitution, but they are also not denied by the Constitution. And then custom are just like traditions that have happened over the course of time that aren't actually law, but it's just carried through like precedent. So like, one president did this and then it just kind of sticks and they keep doing that because of previous administrations. So we're going to look at that first one, which is basic legislation. All right. So basic legislation, basically we're looking at laws that are passed and it's by Congress. Okay. Based on the Constitution. Okay. So for example, in Article 2 of the Constitution, it sets up the offices of the president and vice president. Okay. Obviously very important in the executive branch, but the executive branch is really important because the purpose is to execute the laws, right? It's going to take more than just 2 people to do that. Okay. So I think I've mentioned before that the executive branch is the largest branch of the 3. There's like over 3 million people today that work for the executive branch. And that's all the departments and agencies that are set up. So the Postal Service, the Department of Education, the FBI, okay, any of those types of departments and agencies that you can think of, those are all under the executive branch. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we have to have, a Department of Agriculture. But it's important in order to help execute those laws and regulations to have specific departments that help do that. So Congress has the right to, because it gives them the right to set up those offices. It also, the president and vice president, it also gives them the power to set up other things under the executive branch. Okay, so that's where that comes from. The way that Congress uses its power. So the Constitution, for example, allows Congress to regulate foreign commerce. I mean, that's pretty much all it says. So there are certain express laws in the clauses in the Constitution that give Congress specific power, but it doesn't define it. So it's kind of like, okay, well, it says we can do this, but what does it actually mean? So it's some of it's kind of common sense. So it would make more sense that Congress would regulate foreign trade, right? So trade with other countries versus like individual states. Interstate commerce is another one. So anything that crosses state lines, okay, whether that's like a highway system, whether that is trade amongst states, that's regulated by Congress because it makes sense that the federal government would do that and not individual states because it has to have like a clear path for all states. So again, it's not defined in the Constitution, but it also says that that it doesn't say that they can't do it. So it kind of adds to that. I always say like the Constitution is kind of like a skeleton, and the things that we do as a government kind of add to that. So if you think of it that way, that kind of makes a little more sense. Okay, the second part is what the president does. So executive action. Many actions of the president add to the Constitution. Actually, the phrase executive action you may have heard before, or I can think of the other phrase off the top of my head. I'll come back to it. But a lot of what the president does also adds to the Constitution. So, for example, in the written document, it says that only Congress can declare war, but it also says that the president is the commander in chief. So how do those two kind of work together? Well, the president really can use the armed forces in any way that he, or hopefully she in the future, will see fit, and they don't need the approval of Congress. Where the approval of Congress comes in play is when it's like a large scale war. Okay. So it could be like World War II or Vietnam or something like that, where we've had to actually declare war Actually, I think the most recent one would be the war in Iraq back in like 2002, 2003, was officially declared a war. And that happens because Congress controls the purse strings, okay, which means they control the money. So when you have taken on something like that, you got to fund it. And the president doesn't have the power to do that. So that's where they kind of sometimes have to work together. Executive agreement, okay. A president can make an agreement with another head of a foreign state, so another head of a country, like another president or prime minister, and it's not a treaty, okay? So not to confuse it with a treaty, because a treaty is a formal agreement between two sovereign states, meaning that a treaty is between like the United States and France, okay, or the United States and Japan. It's not through the two individual people, and it's a very formal written document, and that has to be approved by Congress. An executive agreement doesn't have to be formal. It can be an agreement between these two people, and they seal it with a handshake. It doesn't even have to be like a written agreement. So that's something that the president has the power to do. Going back to what I was saying originally, an executive action can also be an executive order. So the president can decide, well, I just want to put this into practice, or I want to put this into law, or I'm going to make this mandate. And the president, you may have seen that with President Trump in the last 4 years. Like sometimes he's held like press conferences where you see him like signing something and he like holds it up, and then he's like, I'm going to do this because it's not going to go through Congress, and people get all like their, feathers ruffled about it. And first of all, you should know that executive orders are used by all presidents. So on average, presidents declare probably between 200 to 300 executive orders during one of their terms of office. FDR was the president that had the most executive orders given. It was over 3,000, but he was also president for a very long time. And a lot of them don't necessarily go through. So like President Trump has tried to do quite a few things where checks and balances come into play, and the federal courts say, nope, sorry, Mr. President, that's unconstitutional. So that is part of executive action as well. So executive order, probably the most infamous executive order given was by President FDR, President Roosevelt, in 1942, which ordered all Japanese Americans into internment camps for most of the rest of the war, which unfortunately was not declared unconstitutional. So there is a little bit of wiggle room there, but a lot of times, just depending on what it is, sometimes they go through and sometimes they are squashed by this side of government, okay, the court. So the Supreme Court, we have the federal court, which is a little bit different, but the Supreme Court, which is the highest court, all they do is look at cases and determine whether something is constitutional or unconstitutional. So when you guys did the legal brief last week, that's kind of what you were looking at in your brief, is what was the constitutional issue? So what was the question being asked? Did this violate someone's rights? Was the school allowed to do this? Or was, the church allowed to do that? So they're looking at constitutional issues. And that third bullet point there, it says SC, that means Supreme Court. Really, that's all they are, is a constitutional convention that's in continuous session, because they are consistently doing that, okay? And their cases definitely impact society, okay? So we have quite a few what they call landmark Supreme Court cases. Historically, probably, I think the biggest one that made the largest impact on society is Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896. That was the separate but equal, which basically legalized segregation across the nation. And so that had huge impacts for almost 70 years on, it was a big backward step towards civil rights for African Americans. And so these court decisions definitely have huge impact. and again, it doesn't mean that those can't be overturned because later courts can do that. In 1803, it wasn't the first Supreme Court case, but it was a very important Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison, which basically set up that idea of judicial review. So when you guys read about the 6 principles of the Constitution, judicial review is the courts using that check. And so that is definitely important. And that's the first case where that actually happens. All right, moving on. Political parties. So, like I said before, the Constitution doesn't mention anything about political parties. But what political parties do is that they really, I know sometimes it doesn't seem like it especially when you're watching the debate and stuff last week, but they really do have a purpose. And in our future chapter, actually, I think it's our next chapter, we're going to learn a little bit more about the role of political parties, but they do a lot of things for us. Okay. So for example, like they are the ones that find candidates. Okay. They're the ones that find candidates and present candidates to the people to vote, especially for the office of president. So they nominate candidates. They held national conventions. We just had one, of course, this past summer because they're held every 4 years before a presidential election. And the convention is an important event, even though this year it was held virtually. But usually they decide on like what their platform is for the party, which is how they feel on certain issues. It's kind of rewritten every 4 years, usually based on the candidates, what the candidate's stance on issues is, presidential candidate. So in the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about nominating candidates or where candidates come from. So the political parties kind of take that on. We will we'll definitely learn about the Electoral College here coming up because I want to get that in before the election so you guys understand exactly how that works. If I told you to open up the Constitution in your textbook right now, you would see that and find the Electoral College, you would see that you probably couldn't find it because that phrase, Electoral College, is actually not in the written Constitution. What you would find is them talking about presidential electors and how that group from each state would decide who the president is. So the Electoral College really works hand in hand with our two-party system. So a lot of times, people talk about why do we only have two parties? I mean, there's more political parties out there, but it's like, why do we only really have 2 parties? Why do we have Republicans and Democrats? Why can't we have other things? Well, there are other things out there. However, the two-party system really just fits in and plays really well with how this is all set up. And so for the Electoral College specifically, if we had multiple parties, that could, and we still have the Electoral College, which we have it because it's in the Constitution, that can set up a lot of issues when it comes to the presidential election. For example, if you have more than one party, then that the chances of having someone that doesn't have a majority of electoral votes or potentially a tie would really mess up an election, because then if that happens, the election goes to the House of Representatives and then they get to pick who the president is, which of course we kind of want to stay away from that. So anyways, we'll get back to political parties later on, but they definitely play a role in how we extend the Constitution. Custom. Okay, so lastly, we're looking at some things that have happened because one president starts it and then it just, follows them. It sets a precedent. The first example of that is a presidential cabinet. And so the president, now we have 15 executive departments, and each department has a secretary. So I know you guys are familiar with like Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education. All of these departments, these head of the departments, they are the advisors to the president. So when a president first comes to office, it's one of the first things they do is they select people who they want to work with. And usually the people are experts in that field. They don't have to be, but normally they are, because the president's going to turn to them when they need to make decisions regarding something that these people are experts about. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you should or should not have a cabinet, but again, it's just become customary for that to happen. Presidential succession. This was actually just talked a lot about over the weekend, if you guys paid attention at all to the news, with President Trump's diagnosis of COVID and him being in the hospital. I know that he just was released last night, but the idea of what happens if the president gets sick and he's sick enough where he can't fulfill the duties of the Constitution. Well, we have something. We have a plan for that. A lot of people think that we've always had this, but it's actually it was actually our 25th Amendment, which was not ratified until 1967. And before that, in the original Constitution, it says that, if the president dies, the vice president becomes president. But that's kind of it, and then it's like, well, what happens if the president, has a stroke? What if the vice president would die along with the president? So there was a lot of unanswered questions. And in the 1960s, this was, let me go back. So it used to be custom, right? Because it was just kind of what we did. But in the 1960s, it becomes an amendment because this was the height of the Cold War. It was the height of the nuclear arms race. And so there was always this fear of like, what would happen if like a nuclear bomb hit the United States? What if it wipes out Washington? How do we keep our government going? So the 25th Amendment is actually a pretty big amendment because it gives a plan of what some choices are. So, for example, the president himself can invoke the 25th Amendment. And the last time that happened was under George W. Bush back in the early 2000s. He was going in for surgery, and before he went in for surgery, he invoked the 25th Amendment and gave the power of the office of president to his vice president, who was Dick Cheney at the time. And then once he was recovered from his surgery a few days later, then he took it back. So that's happened before. The vice president, though, has the power to invoke the 25th Amendment. So if they feel like the president, for whatever reason, whether it is mental health, whether it is physical health, where they feel like they can't, that person cannot fulfill those duties, they can invoke it. Now that becomes kind of complicated because it has to go through Congress. If the president and the vice president dies, we do have a line of succession. So that means that it's set up for, for the worst case scenario. And it goes from like the Speaker of the House to the Senate pro tempore, then to all those department heads in the cabinet. So we do have a plan for that. Senatorial courtesy. Okay, so we know that the Senate approves presidential appointees, but what also happens when the president appoints specifically federal judges is when there's an opening up for a federal judge in a particular state, usually the president will contact those senators and say, hey, do you know of any federal judges who would make, or any judges, that would make a great federal judge for this jurisdiction. And so they usually, it's kind of a courtesy, is what they call it, that the president talks to the senators about that. And then lastly, an example that would also be custom, kind of like presidential succession, where it was just customary that the president only served 2 terms. And George Washington, our first president, set that precedent because he was done after 2 terms and said, hey, I'm done. And I also think it's a good idea that we don't serve more than 2 terms because we don't want someone becoming a tyrannical leader. We don't want someone being in office too long. So that's pretty much what presidents did up until FDR, who was then, he was voted in 4 times. And of course it was, definitely different and challenging circumstances during that time period. But what that did was kind of wake people up and scare people a little bit that we don't want that to become a new precedent. So in 1951, the 22nd Amendment was ratified, and that makes the 2-term limit law. Okay. And there's really no other position in federal government that has those, or I should say, looking back at like representative, Senate, and president, excuse me, the president's term limits are kind of in the middle of those two. So a representative has to run every 2 years. A senator has a 6-year term limit. But I'm sorry, I said that wrong. They have a 2-year term, a 4-year term, and a 6-year term. But the representatives and the Senate do not have term limits. Okay, so that means that they can run forever as long as people keep voting for them. They can keep, running for re-election. The president can't. So that's the point I was trying to make, was that in the federal government, that's really the only office that does not. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our notes for today and for our unit. So Friday, we're going to be having a unit test, and I just want to briefly go over what that is about, or what the format is. Pretty similar to the last test, except you don't have true and false. It's just matching a multiple choice. I will be giving you within the multiple choice a few different scenarios. Not quite as long, but sort of similar to what we did in class about the Bill of Rights and how to apply the Bill of Rights. So basically you'll be asked which amendment would apply in this situation. And so make sure that you do know the Bill of Rights. I think majority of you did really well on the quiz. Most of you got hundreds, if not, A's. So if you didn't do so well, make sure that you go back over those in your packet. There will be a chart on the test, and it is short answer. So you're just kind of analyzing what the chart says. And then the essay, again, it's going to be like last time, where you have a couple choices and you're going to pick one. So just a reminder to only answer one. A couple of you had answered more than one, and I only grade that first one that you answer. So make sure that you pick which one you feel like you can answer best, that you're writing in complete sentences and supporting your opinion with examples. So the test is basically, you're going to definitely look at the note packet, right? Because that's where most things are coming from. But if you want to refer back to your textbook for anything, this kind of combines chapter 2 and 3, although probably more 3 than 2. But you can always look back at your textbook for that. I believe each section in your note packet has the section that we're talking about. So that last one that we just did was 3.2 and 3.3. Again, look over the Bill of Rights and the packet. Make sure that you know what each amendment is, 1 through 10. The Declaration of Independence. So we did that activity in class a few weeks ago. I believe I passed those back, but you can always look in your book as a copy of the Declaration. And of course, they talk about it in the book. But really, all you have to know is what was the purpose of the document? What were the colonists, what were they demanding, or what were they trying to say by writing that document? And it's just kind of general knowledge of it, nothing specific. You don't have to memorize the 27 complaints or anything like that. Also, you can look at, I know in the last class, you guys worked on the anatomy of the Constitution, which was the handout reading. There's also a worksheet that goes with it. I'm going to have you hang on to those until I come back, and I'll collect them. But that is a great resource as well. So if you have read it, that's a really great review of the Constitution. I encourage you to kind of look that over as well while you're studying, and you could do that today in class to help you prepare for the test. Okay, so I think that is all for today. So again, make sure you go back to Classroom on the announcement stream. You're doing these notes, okay? You've got a journal to work on. I'm going to post a Kahoot link that you can use, and whatever time you have left today, you can use to prepare for the test on Friday. I will be available tomorrow. I will be at school for, of course, TCB and flex time in the morning. So if you have any questions, you want to pop in on my Zoom room tomorrow morning and ask me about anything about the upcoming test for Friday, please do so. I will be there. So I hope you all have a great day, and I will see you later.